Larken here, and I have good news and I have bad news. The good news is you are no longer beholden to the U.S. federal government. You no longer have any obligation to do what they say. The bad news, at least it's bad news from your perspective, is that I am now your rightful king. I am your rightful lord and master. Behold my stately robes and my royal crown. Now, I suspect some of you, being the nasty doubters you are, might not believe that I am your rightful king, despite my official declaration to that effect. So let's compare my declaration and my claim to things that you or others like you have believed in the past to see whether I have a valid claim to be your king. So when I declared that the U.S. government no longer has any right to rule you, you might have thought, well, who's this crazy guy to say that? Well, if you believe in the U.S. government at all, you have to believe in the legitimacy of the Declaration of Independence, which nullified the king's supposed right to rule the people here. Sorry, my crown is sort of annoying. So are these robes. So is this. For you to think that the U.S. is a valid country with a valid government, you have to think that it was legitimate to break free from England. Well, what does that mean? How did that happen? Well, that was done by way of the Declaration of Independence, which was some people just saying the king's not in charge of us anymore. And it wasn't very many people. They were claiming to speak on behalf of a few million people that were living in the colonies. They were British colonies at the time. And they just declared, we hold these truths to be self-evident, yada, yada, yada. And I forget how many people actually signed the thing. 30-something, maybe, people out of how many million? Well, okay, in this case, it's just one of me instead of 30 of them, but whoop-de-doo, what's the difference? They were claiming to speak on behalf of a huge number of people that had no say in the matter. And by the way, about a third of the people they claimed to speak on behalf of wanted to remain British colonies. And then another third wanted to not be British colonies, and then the final third basically were like, whatever. They didn't care. So this tiny group of people signed this document just declaring that the king's right to rule us, that's gone because we said so. Well, if they can do it, why can't I? The right of the U.S. government to govern you is gone because I said so. Now, if I wanted to, I could do what they did and write out a big list of complaints of all the nasty things the U.S. government's done. You could probably write out a pretty big list of complaints of nasty things the government has done. In fact, they're way worse than anything King George III ever did to the colonists, like by a mile. Way, way worse. So I could write them out, but I mean, is that what makes the difference? If I declare they're illegitimate, and those guys back then, or did they have like magic parchment? That, well, that declaration counted, that was legitimate, because they used like a quill pen or something, and because it was on magic parchment? Or was it just some people saying, you're not the boss of us anymore, to King George? And then you and almost every American believes that made it so that King George was no longer the boss of them because that very tiny group of people said so. Okay, and I'm there's not 30 of me, there's only one of me, but I'm declaring that the U.S. government no longer has any right to do anything. And I could list a bunch of complaints, but I won't even bother right now. Why is that not just as legitimate as the Declaration of Independence? In fact, the U.S. government is far worse than the king. So why isn't it more legitimate for me to say, I'm declaring independence from you, you don't have the right to do anything to me anymore? Or anybody else. I'm not even declaring it on my behalf, like the Declaration of Independence that said these colonies are now independent. So they claim to speak on behalf of everybody, including a whole bunch of people who didn't even agree with them. So I'm speaking on all of your behalf for the first step to declare they have no right to rule you. And for you to think they ever had the right to rule you requires you to think that the Declaration of Independence was valid and legitimate. Otherwise, we're still British colonies. But if you believe that's legitimate, why would you not believe it's legitimate when I do literally the exact same thing? Just saying they don't have the right to rule us. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Yes, so do I. And it applies to the U.S. crooks as much as it applied to King George. So why do you think the Declaration of Independence was actually legitimate and what I just said wasn't? There is no rational reason. But now we have to get to me being king, because that's probably something you believe even less. Well, if I declare myself king, you might say, well, who are you? You're just some guy. Have you looked at the Constitution? Do you know how many people signed the Constitution? 0. Do you know how many people are named in it as the people bringing it into effect? None. It says, we the people, which was insanely arrogant and completely untrue. Again, a very small group of people. This time it was a different group of people. The funny thing is, most of the small group of people who liked the Declaration of Independence recognized that the Constitution was going in the wrong direction. But that's another discussion. But you had a little group of people saying, we the people, in order to... And then they wrote a whole bunch of stuff just fabricating out of thin air the House and the Senate and the presidency and all these, and the judicial system and all this stuff by just writing it down and saying, well, this is the case. And if I did that and I say I'm king, you probably don't believe me. Why not? What is the difference? Is it because I didn't use big fancy words? Is that like, if I go back and do it with big fancy words, will you then think I'm your rightful king who you're morally obligated to obey? Or would you still just think, well, that's a silly thing to say and totally bogus? Go look at the Constitution. So many people study the Constitution and they're looking at the minutia and the detail about, oh, it structures it so the House and the Senate and this is subordinate to that and this is and there's checks and balances against the executive and the legislative and the judicial and blah, blah, blah. And they don't start from the beginning of like, what the hell? This is words on paper that some people wrote. And they just declare all power shall be vested. Who the hell are you to just declare this thing called Congress having power at all over anybody? It's insane. It is batshit loony to pretend that some people scribbling ink on a piece of paper actually created the right to rule, actually created legal authority. And almost every American believes that. Well, if you believe that, why don't you believe I'm your king? I said so. That's literally all they did. This body has power to do things because we said so. They didn't even say because we said so. It was implied. When they write things like, Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes. It shall? How did that happen? Who said that? You didn't sign it. Did the ink itself make that power come into existence? Because the people who wrote it didn't even take credit for it. There's no name on it. There's no group saying, we the undersigned hereby declare, because that would seem even more insane. Either way, it's totally bonkers. All they did was do a really convoluted, complicated, ridiculous proclamation that they were fabricating out of thin air a group of people with the right to rule. And you believed it? You call their declarations law? Well, then why don't you believe me? When I did literally the same thing. That little line, Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, that collection of ink on that old piece of parchment, that is the excuse for all federal taxation. The IRS harassing everybody, the ATF, the DEA, that most of these are tax agencies. All of it exists because of that tiny bit of scribble. And you think that makes it legitimate and legal and real? Ages ago, I did a video called I'm Allowed to Rob You, which was much like this, but just about the taxing clause. If I write down on a paper, I shall have power to lay and collect taxes, do you believe me? No. Some other human beings did exactly that. They wrote, Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, and you believed them. Why? What possible reason do you have to think that some people, some unnamed people you didn't know who died a long ass time ago, they scribbled some ink onto a piece of parchment, and now that makes it legitimate that there's a gang of 100,000 parasites robbing 200 million people in this country of trillions of dollars. All of that is based on that tiny little ink scribble on that piece of parchment we call the Constitution. Who gives a shit? And if you believe them, why don't you believe me? I hereby declare I shall have power to lay and collect taxes. You each have to go to the description below and send me $5. Now, as it happens, I don't have an enforcement mechanism, so nothing's going to happen to you if you don't. But you're obligated to because I said so. And that's literally all they did to create the federal government. The Constitution, they just made it up. They just said this body is going to have these powers. And almost everybody in the country not only believes it, but hates anybody who doesn't believe it. And they take pride in paying tribute to and obeying the people who have supposed power only because of a scribbled piece of ink on a piece of parchment. Without that, there isn't anything. It all rests on that ridiculous assertion by nobody. This anonymous assertion from hundreds of years ago. So if you believe the U.S. government is legitimate, you have to believe that scribbles of ink on a piece of parchment fabricated out of thin air the right to rule. And you can say, well, it wasn't supposed to be ruling in very many ways, and it was supposed to not violate these rights. Who gives a crap? There's a piece of parchment just declare, it's like if I say I shall have the right to tax you, but only $5. Would that make it any more legitimate? Does that actually obligate you to give me money and give me the right to demand it of you? Because, well, I declared my sovereignty over you. I declared my right to rule. But don't worry, it was a limited right to rule. That makes it legitimate. No, it doesn't. And when I say it, I'm pretty sure every damn one of you recognizes that that's silly and ridiculous. Trouble is, when they said it in the Constitution, you revere it. And you think, well, that was legitimate and that created this great nation of ours. It created a ruling class, and it only created that because people imagined that this tiny group of anonymous people who didn't even put their name on it, scribbling ink on parchment, actually created legitimate authority, the right to rule. Just by going, well, they had meetings and they argued over the wording. Oh, okay. Well, I can bring in some people and we can argue over the wording of how I'm going to declare that I'm your king. Will that make it legitimate? Will that make it okay? No. Now, I hope some people have smoke coming out their ears at this point, because back when I was a constitutionalist and I believed in this great nation of ours and yada yada, and I thought nations were a legitimate thing, I thought countries were actually a legitimate thing, I thought law actually meant something, law as in legislation from government. I believed all that ridiculous mythology, and now when I look back on it, I just think, how did I ever think that added up? Again, I could obsess about the minutia of, well, this doesn't allow this, and you're not supposed to do this. But the minutia of what? The whole Constitution is just bullshit made out of whole cloth, literally. They just made it up, and they just declared, Congress shall have these powers, Article 1, Section 8. Says who? Who the hell are you to just proclaim that this group of political crooks over here has the right to interfere in the lives of these however many million people who had been colonists a couple decades earlier? Both of those steps, the Declaration of Independence and then later the Constitution, were people just declaring stuff. That's all. They didn't do a magic ritual and call upon the gods. They just said, we're saying that this is true. We're saying, King George, you're not the boss of us. That's what the Declaration of Independence was. The reason that was legitimate is because by basic morality, no king has the right to rule anybody. The Declaration of Independence didn't make that true. It didn't make it so that his authority stopped being authority. His authority was never authority, and the Declaration doesn't even recognize that. It sort of pretends that, well, up till now you had the right to rule us, but now we're saying you don't. And that part of the Declaration is just ridiculous. First of all, it's ridiculous to think that it ever had the right, the British Crown ever had the right to rule them. Second of all, it's insane and schizophrenic to say, you are my rightful Lord and King until I decide that you're not, and then you're not. That means you're not. If somebody's your rightful ruler, but only until you decide they're not, then they're not. That means your conscience outranks them. So most of the Declaration of Independence, I totally agree with, because it was people recognizing, you buttheads on the other side of the ocean, you don't get to tell us what to do. Cool. And that was just a statement of truth. You don't have authority over us. You don't have the right to do this to us. That was a description of a truth. And they mangled a few things because they still had statist thought processes. And then they talk about forming a new government, which will better... creating a new stupid ruling class to abuse us even more than the king ever did. Good job. So they still had their statist assumptions, but regarding that particular authoritarian regime, all they were saying was, you suck, you don't have the right to do this to us anymore, you're abusing us, we don't acknowledge your right to rule us. Okay, cool. And that declaration didn't change anything. It didn't make anything true that wasn't true before. It was just some people describing, you don't have the right to do this, this isn't okay. And then the Constitution was 180 degrees in the opposite direction. It was a different group of people, because people like Thomas Paine and Patrick Henry were like, that Constitution is going to be a disaster, it's going to be worse than a king, and they were totally right. But then there's a different group of people saying, we're creating this new union, this federal government, it's going to have these powers. They were just some people in a room saying that, like me in this room saying I'm your king. For you to believe them and not me is only because you have been indoctrinated and brainwashed into imagining that that particular group of people and that particular piece of parchment and those particular scribbles of ink were somehow what? Like superhuman and special and sacred. Yes, sacred, because it is a religious belief you were taught. And people don't think of it in terms like that because they think, well, politics and government law, that's like rational ways to organize. No. You were indoctrinated and brainwashed into the insane religion that says a few people you don't know scribbling some ink on a piece of parchment a few hundred years ago actually made legitimate the giant evil monstrosity in DC with its tentacles all across, half a continent, that it has the right to be there and it has the right to do those things because of that ritual. And most people, and this included me back when I was a constitutionalist, they don't recognize how insane that is. They just accept it as, well, of course, the Constitution created the government, so let's nitpick a bit about the details. Let's not. Let's back up to the beginning and go, what the hell do you think makes it so that a few people in a room scribbling something can actually create into existence a group that has the right to rule you, to rob you, to control you, to quell insurrection, so that if while they're robbing you, you say, hey, we don't like this, they can call out the militia to kill you? Look it up. It's in the Constitution. And they had that power. Why? Because some people said they did. Okay, well then I say I'm your king. If you believe them, then you ought to believe me. Now, the difference is I'm not actually serious. I recognize how insane the claim is, and I would make fun of anybody dumb enough to believe me when I say that I'm their king. But to be consistent, that means I have to make fun of anybody dumb enough to believe that the U.S. government was ever legitimate, that the Constitution created any authority, that any constitution anywhere ever created a legitimate ruling class, because that's the basis of all of them. In any country, in any time span, it's either one doofus saying, I am your king, or a bunch of doofuses scribbling complicated stuff that the peasants don't understand and saying, we have hereby created this legislative body and we now yada, yada, yada. It's all weird, creepy religious ritual to make you bow down to mere mortals and imagine they have the right to rule. They don't. And if you can hopefully recognize that it's silly and stupid and illegitimate when I declare myself to be your king, I want you to think, see if you can get your brain to pierce through your years of indoctrination and assumption and realize every government in the world, every government in history was based on a claim just that stupid, just that ridiculous. And they got all of their power by the peasantry believing those ridiculous claims and believing that some group of people just asserting, we shall have the power to do this, meant they had the right to do it. That's the foundation of all government. And when people wake up one day and go, no, you don't. What do you mean you just, we shall have the power to lay and collect taxes. Screw you. I shall have the power to punch you in the face when you try to. What's this just making shit up? That's not how morality works. That's not how reality works. And yet, you have to believe that some people making that up, that was legitimate for you to believe in government at all, or the Constitution, or law, as in legislation from a governing body. To believe any of that, you have to start with an utterly insane claim, which is a bunch of people saying, we have the right to rule you. Oh, we'll only do it in these special, weird, limited ways, but we still have the right to rule you because we said so. All right, well, for all those of you who still want to believe that shit, then I'm your king. They're not anymore, because I said so, just like the Declaration of Independence. And I am now your king, because I said so, just like the Constitution. So the Constitution doesn't matter anymore, because I just said it doesn't. And I'm now your king, because I said so. So send me a bunch of money. And mostly I'll leave you alone. I'm a benevolent dictator. How can you justify laughing at my claim, which you should, and not laughing at the Constitution? And if that makes you feel awkward and uncomfortable, it's precisely because religious indoctrination is designed to make you unable to rationally examine the foundation of the entire belief system. Because when you do, it crumbles and it evaporates, and you'll realize political authority was never a real thing. It was just some people pretending they had the right to rule a bunch of others, and those bunch of others believing them. When that belief finally goes, when humanity outgrows the insane superstition of authority, so does all authoritarian power, so do all governments. Then we can start acting like grown-ups who don't believe such utterly ridiculous things and don't bow down to insane psychopaths just because somebody said at some point they have the right to rule. So let me be clear. I'm not your rightful Lord and Master, and neither are they.